How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. Today I'm making my first Halo-themed diorama in collaboration with Galactic Armory. This diorama is going to go to them for display, so I needed to build it with custom base dimensions in mind. I marked out the various lengths that I needed, and then cut up the frame of the base on my bandsaw off camera, and I used some corner clamps to hold everything at right angles while the glue was curing. After the glue on the first two corners was dry, I moved the clamps over to the other two corners and I did the same thing. And then finally I glued the center joist in place for a little more support in the middle. For the base of this diorama, I'm using a sheet of XPS insulation foam, which I glued down to the wooden frame using some foam safe superglue. After trimming the foam a little bit, I sanded the sides of this base so that the foam and the wood would have a nice consistent surface. Before I build up the terrain, it was time to assemble a pelican. In case you're not familiar, pelicans are a type of large water bird that have long beaks and a stretchy neck pouch that they use to catch their prey. It's also the name of this flying transport vehicle from Halo, and one of the files that was sent to me by Galactic Armory for this build. The scene that was requested is from a cutscene in Halo Reach, in which a Scarab is blocking your path, and your squad leader, Carter, after he's been fatally wounded, pilots his Pelican into the Scarab, sacrificing himself to advance the mission. It's quite a memorable moment. I'll just show it to you right here so you know what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not going to be building this arch in the foreground, but rather focusing in on the terrain in the back where the Scarab is perched, and I will have to make some slight alterations to accommodate the size of it, but it should still look pretty good in the end. I broke out some styrofoam and began carving it down to the rough shape of the rock formations using my hot wire. I then refined it and gave it a more rocky texture using my butane torch. I used the torch to also add some variation to the canyon floor, and then I made the other side of the canyon using the same method as the first, carving off the big chunks with the wire and then refining it afterward. Once the shapes of the terrain had been established, I glued everything together using some foam safe superglue. The next step was to smooth out the seam between the hills and the canyon floor using some Sculptamold. I mixed up a batch and then I worked it around the base with my gloved hand, trying to create a gentle curve to the canyon floor, kind of like what you'd see at a place like Arches or somewhere in Arizona. After that, I mixed up some plaster, paint, and Mod Podge, and I covered the rest of the exposed foam with that protective coating. This will protect the foam and it'll also preserve the detail of the rocks better than the Sculptamold. I sprayed on some isopropyl alcohol, and then once the surface was nice and smooth, I set it aside to dry, and by this time all of the many pieces of my Scarab had finally finished printing. This is the second vehicle that was sent to me by Galactic Armory, the collaborator and sponsor of today's video. I've used Galactic Armory for a number of my Star Wars dioramas in the past. They offer a full array of different kinds of files, ranging from small detailed miniatures and busts, to life-sized suits of power armor from Halo and life-size bolters from Space Marine. Whether you're into miniatures, like me, or cosplay, they probably have something that will catch your eye. With a membership to their Patreon, you can gain access to all of their incredible wealth of resources and files from all the iconic nerd realms that they draw from. To get access to their files, exclusive content, and a ton of other perks, head over to patreon.com/galacticarmory. $15 a month gets you all newly released 3D files from the current and previous month, and a yearly subscription gets you all the 3D files that they've ever made. That's currently several hundred models. Again, that's patreon.com/galacticarmory. After the legs of this gigantic 3D print had been glued into their positions, I began working on creating the pathway for the wires that will get power to the lights. And the reason I'm wearing gloves while I do this is because I hollowed all of the pieces before printing them to reduce the weight and make them easier to work with. But that meant that every time I drilled through them, there was a chance of uncured resin getting on my fingers. I did drill holes and ran stiff wire between all of the joints of the legs, but in order to pass the wires through safely and add a little more support to the model, I decided to anchor it with a metal pipe passing all the way through the base into the body of the Scarab. I dremeled the hole that I needed, I made sure it was a snug fit, and then I glued the pipe piece into the foam, which I supported underneath with another piece of wood. The next step was to drill a hole in the side of the Pelican. This thing is going to be suspended mid-air, about to crash into the Scarab, with fire coming out the right side just behind the wing, so wires did need to make it all the way there. I used the same metal pipe, and I bent it to hold the Pelican at the right angle, in the right place, and then I drilled 2 more holes in the side of the Scarab, so that the pipe could pass all the way through. Doing this will make it far easier to access those wires on the other side, and it won't be visible from the correct viewing angle. Lastly, I marked out and drilled a small hole for the filament that will represent the shot fired from the Pelican right before it makes impact. With that, all of the pathways for the wiring were established on the Scarab, and I drilled a final larger hole for the switch on the base off camera. After that, it was time to begin painting. I broke out and loaded up my airbrush, and while I paint these minis, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. Halo Reach is probably the game that I would say I had the most fun playing with my brothers and friends when I was younger. I played all the other Halos, but something about Reach's multiplayer was just the best, especially Forge World. I don't play many games these days, but every now and then, my brothers and a group of friends and I will get together and play Halo Reach. We'll spend an evening playing SWAT, Infection, or all of the community-made mini-games that we love, like Bumper Cars and Jump Rope. I have a lot of fond memories from Reach, so when Aaron from Galactic Armory reached out and he asked for this idea from Reach, I was really happy about that. Both of the miniatures in this diorama will be available over on Galactic Armory if you'd like to recreate it yourself. After the iconic purple base coat was on the Scarab, I gave the whole thing a glazing coat of sepia, followed by a quick dry brushing to grab all those details, and with that the Scarab was done and it was time to jump over to the Pelican Popsicle. I threw washes over top of the established base coats and then dry brushed with a light green-gray to highlight all the edges. After that I painted on the individual color details, like the warning labels and the windshield, and finally I tinted it with a green wash to get that military green just right. And with that the models were done and it was time to paint the terrain. I used the airbrush to add layers and striations to the rock formations to establish a better sense of visual topography and to look a little bit more like exposed desert rock. I followed that up with lighter colors to blend everything together and finally threw on a burnt umber oil wash to complete the organic rock coloration look. The key is to dab off the oil wash with a paper towel as you go to make sure that the pigment doesn't build up too much in any one place. I follow that up with one final light sandy pass from the airbrush and a dusting of pigment powder which I locked in place using isopropyl alcohol. With that, the painting was pretty much done and I could move on to the most time-consuming part of this build, which was the wiring. The silicone coating these LED noodles does not stick to anything, so in order to get it to stay where it needs to be, I threw it in some clear heat shrink, which does stick to things. I started pulling the wires through to all of the places where they needed to be, and I tested everything along the way to make sure it was working properly before fixing anything in place for good. I think for the first time in any of my builds that I've ever made with lights, I did not have to go back and completely redo the wiring because I had wired it backwards or because I broke a filament, so that was very encouraging. The last light to get wired up was the shot from the Pelican, and then I began the long process of fishing all of the wires through the body of the Scarab back to the bay door at the back and the bottom of the vehicle. To create the impact point on the Scarab and fill in the gap around the flame on the Pelican's wing, I used some hot glue. I then moved back to the back of the Scarab and I separated all the positive and negative leads. I stripped them and wired them together so I would have a parallel circuit, keeping the voltage requirements to a minimum. Once all the wires had been reduced to a single positive and negative lead, I fished those back through the body of the Scarab and I pulled them through the hole that will get the wires into the base. I then brought back the base and began working on the power supply. This whole thing runs off a 3-volt battery pack and a potentiometer so the brightness can be adjusted. Before installing the switch, I needed to clean up these sides. Off camera, I cut up some wooden veneer and then I sanded the edges for a nice clean profile. Unfortunately, I did mess up the paint job that I had already done a little bit while I was doing this, and there were also some gaps, so I filled those with Tamiya putty. I sanded it again, and then I repainted the edges to get everything back to its pre-veneer state. When that was dry, I cut out the spot in the veneer where the switch will go, and I painted the sides of this bad boy with black 4.0. It was then time to add that switch and wrap up this project. I pulled the wires from the Scarab through the base and I connected it to the power source and to the switch, and there were no issues, which I was very grateful for. And after that, I called it good. After looking at the diorama for a minute, I realized it was missing something, and that something were figures in the correct scale. This is 1 to 200 scale, but you really couldn't tell without the miniatures. So I went to Galactic Armory and I found 2 Master Chief options that they had. I downloaded those, printed them in 1 to 200 scale, and after they were painted, I glued them to the front right corner of the diorama. And after those had been glued in place, I really did call it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you to Galactic Armory for sponsoring this project. I'm also in the middle of a Kickstarter campaign for my Wild Imaginary West RPG, so if you haven't checked that out already, you definitely should. Huge shout out to all of my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.